So this is, again, major key is your overall proportion in the case of value, lightness to darkness, and your minor key is your range of contrast within the image. Now, contrast relationships between the major and minor keys are directly connected to the mood. For instance, a low major and a high minor might be scary and threatening, okay? Whereas a medium major and a medium minor might produce a more dreamlike state. I'm going to show you some variations on that so we can see. Okay, here's how our major and minor tonal contrast can start to work. Okay, the images on the top up here. There's one that's mostly light, mostly medium, and mostly darker, right across the top. Okay, so but the range or the minor key is high contrast on the one on the left. Okay, and it stays fairly high all the way through. Okay. Now, if we look at the change of major and minor keys in the 9 panels below with the circles in them, the divided circles, what we're going to see is the row or the column on the left is overall light, column in the medium is overall medium, and the column on the right is overall low or darker. You guys see that? So we have a light column, medium column, and a darker column. Now, if we look at the rows across the top, we have a low minor key, a low range of contrast. Across the middle, we have a middle range of contrast, and along the bottom, we have a high range of contrast. So our minor key in rows are low, medium, high. And you can see out of all these 9 images, they produce a different emotional response. Okay? The one on the lower right does could be a little more scary or threatening. The one in the top middle to the top right could feel a bit more dreamlike. The one in the lower left could be more happy and uplifting. Okay? I've done the same thing this time with the depiction of a cube. But what I've done is I've just arbitrarily changed, well, not arbitrarily, but I've purposely changed the value range on these cubes in the major and minor key to create different lighting effects. Okay? So the first one is a bit more of a soft diffuse light in overall light. And then I have the second one across the top is a hazy sunlight, and then more of a full sunlight. And then in the lower row, I start to darken the overall image. So I'm changing my major key. I'm darkening my major key a little at a time. And it starts to feel like more artificial light, and then a strong light in the dark, and then a spotlight in the dark. So these things will change, and they change the mood. And all I'm doing is I'm determining between my major and minor key. I'm adjusting between my major and minor key. So as it appears in the top set up here, I'm looking at it just in the abstract, like color swatches, but down below, I'm really looking at it in terms of the response, in terms of the appearance of light and shadow. Okay? So the same ranges of contrast or sets between major and minor key can be played out whether your image is notan dominant or form dominant. It doesn't matter, because these tonal ranges are going to be, between your major and minor key, are going to be what determine the mood of your composition. So here's a setup, and this is the way I might approach something, is we've started with our initial matrix, okay? And the top image on the left here is basic matrix. It's just dividing, I just divided the image into just black and just white, okay? So that's the major division of my tonal contrast, okay? And then what I did, the image below that on the left, what I've done is I've established the value range in the black zone of my matrix. Now, none of those values are going to be, there's going to be a gap, a difference between the values in my dark area of my matrix and the values in the light area of my matrix. There's going to be, I'm going to keep a gap there. So that being the case, nothing in this second image down, there's nothing in those mid values that's going to be as light as anything in light. Okay? So the image on the right, the top image on the right now, what that is, I went back and this is the black part of my matrix, and then only the value group in the light zone. Does that make sense? So if you look at the top image, it's only the matrix, and the one below that is the matrix with only the values in the dark zone. The one on the right is only the values in the light zone. But I've kept those as value ranges separate from one another. And the one on the bottom left is when I combine them. And when you combine them, it gives you this tonal clarity. So your image remains clear because you've established these tonal value groups with separation. So you need to have that separation in order to make it work. Okay? And that will keep your images really clear and distinct. So here again, here's another example of that. Okay? This started off, this was an oil painting demonstration, and what I did is I went back, because I was explaining it, I went back and did a digital version of it. I just scanned it and painted over it. But what I did is I established these value groups. And the key here is, determine these particular value groups. And you can see that I have 4 value groups. The lightest is the small value group, and then the next value group is a very large range in there, and then another medium to small group, and then a larger group. The critical thing here is the gap in between. Again, it's in many cases of what you draw and paint, it's not about what you're drawing and painting, it's the in-betweens. That's the key. And we don't often think of the in-betweens, okay? It's really about the glue in between these parts that really gives you all of the nuance and all of the clarity of what you draw and paint. Yeah, the question is, can you do this same type of breakdown for your visual components? If we were talking about color, could you do it for color temperature or hue? Yes, you can do this for any type of design. This is just design clarity. This is just breaking it down for your clarity. And in fact, this will be a factor in your finished piece, whether you design it or not. It will be there in some form. It's going to happen. So there's kind of a saying about films too. A film is going to be designed. It's like your painting. It's going to be designed. Your drawing, it's going to be designed. It's going to either be designed by your design or designed by default. Okay? So those images that we admire are usually designed and controlled and managed. They're designed with a plan. And we sense a plan within that image. And then that's how we feel that clarity in the image. To gain that clarity, we just need to set the plan. That's all. It's just setting the plan. Okay? And having some idea about that as you begin. And this is one way that you can apply it. But again, here, achieving this tonal clarity, we don't often talk about the gaps in between, but you don't need the full spectrum. You don't need the full range of values. What you need is clear and distinct groups that have appropriate value ranges that give you gaps. And those gaps will actually define some clarity. It'll keep one area separated from another. Okay? This was a demonstration in an Andrew Loomis book. And what it is really just looking at the trying to get some kind of sense of light. But what he's doing is he's dividing it and doing it by the numbers. This is really breaking it down. The first one you can see, if it's a number 1 in light or a number 1 value in light, it'd be a number 2 in shadow. Same object, it would just be 1 step darker. The second one would be 2 steps darker, the next 3, and so on. Okay? Now, this is not how light really works. This is a great example as a training tool for illustrators to make sure that they're in print, things will always read clearly. Okay? It's not really how light works. We do have to have a separation. I put this in here only as just a reminder that having a distinction between your tonal range in light and tonal range in shadow, you got to have a gap. And if you have a gap, you'll have clarity. it doesn't really go by numbers. You can't really predetermine this too much. So this is more of a reality of what happens. Okay. What happens is, if you look at the little circles on the right, the tonal contrast in the mid-range, there's greater contrast in that mid-range of values than there is in the darks above, than there is in the lights below. That often happens in nature. That's really more about how light really works. And so that difference, those ranges of contrast, those are what you want to look for, if you're doing portraits, or if you're doing landscape, or if you're doing any drawing or painting from anything you see. You need to determine what those are. Okay, that's a lot of information we've been going through. But really, if you want to have a really clear image, then you have to answer some of those questions and clear some of those things up. Because as we know, we look at these artists' work that we admire. We admire them in many cases because they make the complicated look very simple. So they've edited all these things and they've made these decisions for us. And that's why we admire them, because we can see that they have a clarity in their vision. But this is a way to get clarity and to look for the right thing. That's what I'm trying to do, is kind of point out these things that you can look for to solve your problems. Okay? Here's another image. Put this on the screen here. There you go. Okay, so this was a painting that I did on location. So I went out, and it's about 20 by 24, and I went out, and when I sketched it in, I sketched in with some thin wash of paint thinner and a slight amount of paint. And I was determining my value groups. That's what I did. I was setting up these value groups. And that was really important. Okay, because it was a white building and it had this warm and cool temperature changes. And I wanted to reflect all of that. And so what I did was I set up these value groups. So these are my separate value groups. Now within that area of 3, I'm going to have a range of values. In the area of 5, I'm going to have a range of values. In 2, I have a range of values. I have a range of temperatures. Okay, color temperatures. I have, and so I can work within that value set. Are these zones subject dependent, or are they overall? In terms of your composition, and it would be overall composition. So if I had a person standing on the front steps out there, and their skin or their dress, let's just say their dress was the same value grouping as the building in shadow. Okay, that would be a number 3. I would use the same value group in that dress that I would use in that number 3 zone. It's not subject dependent. Okay, and that's one thing that we end up running into with form, because when we start talking about form and rendering form, we're talking about usually figure drawing or figures, but we don't include the background, and then we don't include a contact shadow on the ground with the shadow on the form. It's actually the same shape locked together. So think of it as the same shapes locked together. Okay? Here's some tonal ranges. Okay? These were from a designer by the name of Tadahiro. And what I did is I did that same group of value sets. Okay? On the left, the column up and down is all light, all medium in the middle, and all dark on the right. Now, the ones on the left, the top row has low contrast. The ones in the middle have medium contrast. And the ones along the bottom row have high contrast. You see that? So those are the distinctions that we establish above. And that's what you're going to see in images. And they're going to give you completely different moods. Another way of looking at it, is this way too. Here's 3 little comps. The one on the left is the major key is high, all right? And the middle one, the major key is low. And the one on the right it's really tough because it's kind of 50-50. It's in the middle. But there's a good portion that's middle value in there, right? Now, if we look at the bottom images, I kind of pixelated and grabbed those. We can see the minor key or range of contrast. That's what you see underneath those pixelated images, is the range of contrast. So the range of contrast in the first one is medium. The range of contrast in the middle one is low. And the range of contrast in the one on the right is very high. Okay? So it's the combination or of the result of your major key and your minor key that actually create the mood of an image. Either one can slide either way. They can go either way. Here are a couple images that I did. These were paint overs, actually paint over CG geometry, but you can see the two images on the left. They're different times of day, different qualities of light. There was going to be a passage of time, and so it was going to be kind of a cross dissolve between one frame and the next, and we needed to determine what the light condition and the color was going to be between those two. Again, the ones on the right, it was another situation where the one on the top was going to be a little more illuminated. The one on the bottom, we needed a little bit more threatening, so I included more a lower major key. I darkened it up. The upper one is a low major key, or low, but the one on the bottom is really, really dark major key. So the difference is going to give you that contrast. Now these were an experiment. This was just an experiment in a range of contrast and trying to capture a certain time of day. My initial painting was this one. This was the first one. And I painted this in the afternoon. I went out and did this. I took a canvas out a couple of times to paint this, spent about 25 minutes each time because the light changed. So I worked on it for a little while. And then as I was cleaning up the first day, I packed up my stuff and I loaded it in the car. And then I realized, wow, there's a better painting to be had. And it looks totally different. And that was the one that's just, about an hour after the first one. So what I did was I came back the next day with two canvases. And I worked on the first one for the first time. And then I started my second one. And so, I looked at those. And then I came back a couple of days to work on them some more. And then what I did was the traffic was really heavy. So I stayed around in town, grabbed a bite to eat. And then when I left, I drove back by and I ran in and I saw the artificial light on this. And I thought, wait a minute, I'm going to take a picture. I couldn't paint because I couldn't even see what I was doing out there. But I took a picture and I thought, well, this would be a great example of trying to depict what's the tonal contrast and what's the range that really tells me the time of day or the type of lighting, and how does that equate to my major and minor key. This is a low major key and a high minor key. It's mostly dark overall. The reds and oranges and stuff, they look really saturated on the screen, but they're quite dark overall. The first painting, I'll go back to the first one. This first painting, this was the one I saw this. I wanted to paint this architecture, and so I went there to paint it, okay? And I was there during that time of day, and I moved around it until I found an area or a position that had the certain light quality that I wanted to paint. And the design of it worked in a way that I wanted to paint that. I wanted a little bit more backlit. I wanted to see the difference in color temperature. That's what I was after in the beginning. So I only went for that. Then it was by accident, it was afterwards, I saw a different light source where I saw this one. And what I saw was there were more saturated colors, a few darker values, and a higher contrast overall. So my minor key increased. So I went back to paint this. And really, I was painting the difference between the two. Because I thought, oh, well, this was at this time of day, and one was at 3, and one was like at 5, or something like that. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to really push the contrast. And by painting two paintings at once, I'm now thinking about what are the differences. And now I'm including what I've learned about the differences into the actual paintings to make them more successful, more depicting of that time of day, because I'm comparing it to a different time of day. Okay? Now, after that, again, like I mentioned before, I went back and took a photograph of this. And now that I had done those first two paintings, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to do the third painting, and I'm going to do this one and really push that quality of artificial light, dropping everything down and making those lights feel even brighter and maintaining some saturation in those light values. Now, once I did those three and I went down, added more and more contrast, the second one was more contrast in the minor key. The third one was changing the major key, dropping it way down. I thought, okay, now I'm going to do the inverse of that, and I'm going to do this image, and I made this one up. And I made this one up because I thought, okay, what happens when it's overcast? I see more color temperature change. I don't see tonal contrast. So my minor key, my major key went up, and my minor key went down, less overall contrast. So what it made me do is put more color temperature difference to create more vibration in those individual zones. So I was still maintaining a level of contrast, but I shifted it from value contrast to color temperature contrast, making the difference in those times a day. So and I had done years of plein air painting, and I would go out and do a little sketch here, go out and do a little sketch there. And then I realized I could be doing that for a long time, but am I really growing? Am I really learning something here? Am I really breaking it down? And with boxes and boxes of sketches, I started thinking, no, there's more out there. And I started reading more about and realizing that, Monet wasn't taking little panels out. He was taking big canvases out. And I thought, I need to do that. I need to go find out what it means to do that. And in doing it, I learned this. The question was, did Monet think about these things as he did his paintings? He called his paintings designs. And so through the way that he talked about them, I could tell he liberated himself from the actual depiction of, or the need to actually render all the little natural aspects of it. He was really influenced by, like the other Impressionists, by these Japanese prints that were really mostly no-tan. The question was, would you use your major and minor key, or do you use that to determine your area of focus? And it can be, the result can be an area of focus. It's not necessarily the tool to create your area of focus. That's really pretty much more about where you design it in your picture. That has to do with your matrix. Your major and minor keys of value will determine your mood. That will set up the mood of your image most clearly. How you arrange those light and dark patterns, that's another issue. It'll still be there in your work, but that arrangement is I'm keeping that separate from the result of major and minor key and tone. Most of Vermeer, most of his paintings like this one are mostly no-tan. Even though there's a light coming in, it's a bit diffused, okay? But he will put a strong form contrast. In this case, he's got the greatest contrast in the shadowed area of the woman's headpiece, okay? You see, there's form on her face and real light and real dark in that area. And then there's a little bit from the cast shadow on the wall. But other than that, each zone has a pretty distinctive value. Like the wall is much lighter than the picture on the wall. The frame, or excuse me, the metal bar holding the base of that map on the wall, that's dark compared to the map. The frame on the window, the leaded glass, all of these things have strong, distinct values of their own, okay, that stand apart from just the effect of light and shadow. There's only little bits of the effect of light and shadow in there. Here's a couple images that have more graphic images that have more tonal contrast. Let me put it this way. This might be better. There we go. Again, a low major key, and makes it a little bit more somber with low, medium, minor key. You see, there's a little tiny bit of a flame in the image, but overall, it's a bit more somber. This one, the major key is a little bit brighter, and there's a greater element. There's a presence of light values here that is much lighter, or excuse me, much larger in the scene. So that yellowish area and yellow-orange area, they're lighter in the scene. So just by having a greater amount on there kind of lightens it up as well. Now, in terms of a mood, an image that has a high major key and a high minor key has a tendency to feel happier, more uplifting. And that's where Sorolla comes in. Many of his paintings were overall medium to high major key and high minor key. Okay? So he does give you some elements of really lights and darks with a medium to medium high major key. Mostly medium to light. They appear light. This one appears light. So, and that's the interesting thing about his paintings. It appears like most of this is high key, very light, and then it has a high range of contrast, mediums and darks in there, right? To a smaller degree. But on the other hand, when you see his actual paintings, you realize he did bring all the values down slightly so that he could maintain a lot of saturation in his colors. Because if you went really, really light, they'd be a little more pastel, like some of the other Impressionists. Okay? Here's an illustration by Howard Pyle. And I just kind of use this. This is the original image. And then I just kind of messed with the values, trying to make it a little bit more threatening. So I included a dark value across the top. That tends to make it a bit more foreboding than the first image. Overall darker, and I increased the tonal contrast, so the light in the horizon is lighter. It's overall dark, lighter horizon, and that dark across the top. And this one, I darkened everything even more, kept the light, and I put little bits of a rim light along there, and see how those little bits start to make it feel, when they're surrounded by those darks, it starts to feel more threatening, more scary and threatening in this case. So I've provided on here a few images, and I've just grouped these from overall dark, increasing the major key as you go. Across the top row is dark, getting lighter and lighter and lighter, major keys, and then the bottom row from medium to lightest. And that's your greater proportion, right? So it's the overall proportion. Now, within these images, the minor key, the range of contrast, and even the amount of contrast in your minor key, or the size of those bits. In the first one, it's a high minor key, but it's very, very small little bit. In the next one, it's a high minor key, or medium high minor key, but there's a larger amount of it. The overall is still dark. The next one, there's a larger amount of light within that mostly dark image. And the other one is mostly medium with some light parts. On the bottom row, the bottom left, nothing is really black. It doesn't go really, really dark. It's mostly in the medium, so it feels a little more dreamlike in that image. And then the next one to the right, with the little robot on the left, there's some really darks that appear. The next one, there's not a lot of really dark, and I put that in there in contrast to the last image of the man and the umbrella on the beach, where it's overall light with high contrast, a high minor key. The one to the left has a low minor key, high major, low minor. So all of these kind of convey a little bit different mood. You can also see in here, some of the shapes have a little factor in here as well. Okay, so if this is overall light and I have a small amount of dark, an overall light and a larger amount of dark, it's still, and it's the same value. Now we're looking at the proportion of in our major key. Will this have an effect? Does this affect the minor key? It doesn't affect the minor key, right? It's still about proportion. So it's the range. Now, if I said in this little image, in this one, there's a range in here that is like medium to dark, and in this one, I'll make this really, really dark. And this medium dark, okay? A smaller proportion and medium dark. You can see this kind of expands this area out. And this is going to feel like it's heavier overall because this associates with this tonal contrast. Where this, if I even lighten this up just a little bit, that little area in there is going to tend to group with the light. So it splits off and separates and starts to group with the light, where this one starts to group with the dark. Okay? So how we divide these things up, there's not a real rule on how that breaks down. That's going to happen within our image. But when we're aware of that, we can design with that. That can become a tool that we use. Okay? First part is being aware what's on your palette. These are tools for us to use. And once you're aware of what you can do, then you can explore different options that you might have. Okay, in this illustration, you can see that these are value groups as well. Okay, you can see they're clear, distinct value groups. But these value groups, they appear to be light and shadow, the appearance of light and shadow. But the artist was very, very careful to put dark over light over dark over light over dark over light. So the clarity of the image really relies on this stacking of lights and darks. Okay? So that he gets this in what appears to be, it could be a pretty flat area, you get this dramatic lighting. And that's different than this image. In this image, there's also tonal contrast, but in this image, there's super high contrast in the foreground. And then as you go back into distance, the contrast is reduced into the far distance. Okay? So that tonal contrast is working with spatial depth here. So it's consistent with the spatial depth. So as you go back into space, things will become more like the horizon. They'll be more like that value. You'll reduce contrast as you go back, in this kind of a day or kind of a lighting. So this range of contrast has more to do with the light to shadow or contrast range in the foreground, midground to background as changing the range of contrast or changing the minor key as you go back. We can look at this image too, and you can say, okay, what's your major key and your minor key? And clearly, it's a low overall major key. It's a high minor key because there's really bright values in here. But take a look at what he did. Look at the armor compared to his skin, hair, and cloak, right? Take a look at that armor and the tooled belt that he's got over his shoulder, the strap. Those areas, he's designated those areas as the areas of highest contrast. So he keeps the highest contrast in particular zones. Okay? And that's how he really produced metal to look like metal and skin to look like skin and the fabric to look like fabric, is because he determines where those contrasts will be. The range of contrast within your design, can be designed in as well. And this is a good example of how you could depict that. This is an illustration that's mostly, it's notan dominant, where the other was chiaroscuro. This is notan dominant, but you can also see there's areas of contrast, and those contrast zones or areas, he's kept in separate zones. I mean, this is something that's happened from the beginning of time. Okay, you take a look at the stripes on his shirt, to the shapes in the background, to the shapes on the woman, the way he's handled the light and the little bugs around the lamp. Okay, and then her features stand out dark against her light, warm face. All keeping that separation. I put that last one in contrast to this Rembrandt painting, and yet again, in this piece, he has a broad range of tonal contrast here. Okay, broad range of tonal contrast, but it's in the little reflection of the little band on his hat and his necklace and the beading on his shirt that you really see the highest contrast of dark or light surrounded by dark. And that's what gives the range of these textures as well. This is Ottavio Mazzonis. In these images, they're clearly warm, cool paintings. But what he's done is he's manufactured the value grouping. Is all contrived value grouping. He's determined where he wants you to look and how he wants that pattern to move around. So he's locking dark shapes and light shapes and designing those. Again, grouping the lights. In this case, he would just group the lights so that, she disappears against his coat, and only certain elements show up. Here's a darker image overall. And yet, within this design, there's different ranges of contrast. Okay? There's a softening, you can see that in the grass, there's a range of tonal contrast. Within the guy's cape, there's a range of tonal contrast. Okay? So the horse and the cape, or capes, have a certain range of tonal contrast within that dark zone. The ground has a certain range of contrast in the foreground. The background ground has a range of contrast. The mountains in the back have a range of contrast, and it's broken up differently. Those little bits of snow back there are broken up a little differently. And then you have the effect of metal, because you have a super high range of contrast within that one zone.